I'm happy to welcome you this afternoon to this afternoon's interdisciplinary panel on reconciliation and the humanities and social sciences research hosted by the Federation. This panel is about wisdom. I'll attempt to be wise by using a minute less than those that were assigned to me at the beginning. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we are gathered here this afternoon in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. En 2015, la Fédération a annoncé qu'elle s'engageait à promouvoir la réconciliation entre les peuples autochtones et non autochtones. Elle met tout particulièrement l'accent sur le rôle déterminant que tiendront l'éducation postsecondaire et les sciences humaines et sociales dans les processus de recherche, de compréhension et d'action en faveur de la réconciliation. If you'd like more information or have ideas to move the whole issue together, please speak to Gauri Srinivasan and Elaine Young, who are here, and also pick up one of the handouts that the Federation has prepared. Through consultation with our members, it's become clear that research practice is an area where HSS scholars can make positive change towards reconciliation. Clear also that our members are looking for more opportunities to learn and discuss about these matters. This panel aims to support that interdisciplinary dialogue and learning on the current state of and methodologies for conducting respectful and mutually beneficial research with Indigenous communities. The title of this afternoon's panel is Wise Research Practices, a term that can have many meanings and that this afternoon's panelists will no doubt explore. En contraste avec les meilleures pratiques, les pratiques sages sont celles qui permettent de tenir compte des circonstances dans lesquelles les gens vivent. Wise practices are not one size fits all. They're locally appropriate, they recognize the diversity of Indigenous cultures, and they're informed by the worldviews of those cultures. We're lucky to have brilliant people this afternoon, and they will be introduced by our moderator, Dr. Peter Russel. Peter is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Toronto. His most recent book is Canada's Odyssey, a country based on incomplete conquest, and in my judgment, he's been one of the wisest presidents of the association I'm a member of, the Canadian Political Science Association. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guy. It's great to have you here, and I'm going to introduce our three really most interesting panelists with very diverse experience, beginning with Chelsea. Maybe I'll do them one at a time because then it'll well sink in. If I give you all three, I'm just thinking out loud. I think it's better to do. Let's do it because you're going to speak first, Chelsea.
Sure. Yes.
And then I can really focus on you as a Métis from Manitoba, Rivers, Manitoba, assistant professor right now in the Department of Health, Aging, and Society, and the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University. Dr. Gabel, Chelsea, is the director of the McMaster Indigenous Research Institute, an institute dedicated to Indigenous ways of knowing and research. Dr. Gabel is currently leading 3 SHIRK grants as principal investigator and is involved in a number of research collaborations across Canada that integrate her experience in community-based participatory research, full voice, digital technology, intervention research, and Indigenous health and well-being. She's also a member of the Canadian Institutes for Health Research Standing Committee on Ethics that provides high-level strategic advice on the ethical, legal, and social cultural dimensions of CIHR's mandate. May I just say one thing I'm going to bring into the discussion? and later on. But when we get into more the Q&A, 22 years ago, my gosh, time flies, I was the chair of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Advisory Committee on Research. I had 6 really leading Aboriginal scholars from all parts of the country, many disciplines, and 6 non-Aboriginal scholars, history and economics and law, all major disciplines. And one of our jobs was to draw up guidelines for research early in RCAP's experience, because RCAP was doing a lot of research on Aboriginal communities. And this was the pamphlet that they produced. I'll hear you, and if there are things in here that weren't in your talks, I'll bring them in. One that just struck me from the beginning that I learned about, one of the principles of wise research and Aboriginal people is this. I'll just read it. Aboriginal people have had almost no opportunity to correct misinformation or to challenge ethnocentric and racist interpretations. In other words, they haven't had an opportunity to look at what's being written about them before there were anything like ethical guidelines or the kind of wise research comments today. So one of the RCAP's policies was to take in what the former Aboriginal writers about Aboriginal people had been saying and what their information was. And it was amazing how you learned the inadequacy of past research and writing. So I just saw that in. It's one of the, I thought, wise principles. So now, Chelsea.
Great. Okay. Bring my coffee up, I think. Okay. I have my lunch over there. I was too nervous to eat, so it's sitting over there. All right, well, thank you very much for having me. I have to say, this is it's nerve-wracking to be up on a stage with these 3 amazing people and scholars, but I'm very, very excited to be part of this panel this afternoon. We all went for lunch beforehand, and I almost feel like you should have been part of that conversation. That was the conversation. I was saying we should have just hit record and then played it, because we had some really, really great conversations. So thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. So the project I'm going to touch on this afternoon is part of a SSHRC Knowledge Synthesis Grant that I have. It's in collaboration with my colleague who's sitting in the audience, Dr. Michelle Dion, in political science at McMaster University. So this is a project that we are working on, a team of us. And just for some of you who maybe just a really brief background about the SSHRC Knowledge Synthesis Grant, it is a response to the final report of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which highlights the critical role Canadian social science and humanities scholars can play in enabling action to knowledge in areas such as child welfare, education, health, justice and corrections, Indigenous rights, and nearly every other aspect of Canadian life. So SSHRC launched this call, and the call was, how are the knowledge systems, experiences, and aspirations of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples essential to building a successful and shared future for all Canadians? So Michelle and I applied for this grant last summer, and we were successful at getting the grant in November 2016. So that's what I'm basically going to talk about for my next 10 minutes, but it's not really going to be 10 minutes, but I'm going to try really hard. So our knowledge synthesis grant, what does it do? It critically examines some of the methodological trends in social science research on Indigenous issues in Canada. And we pay particular attention to the participation of Indigenous scholars, peoples, and communities. So as part of this grant, we're actually constructing and analyzing 2 bibliographic databases to answer the 3 questions that I have on this PowerPoint slide. And these questions are crucial to assess the extent to which Indigenous scholars, peoples, and communities are active participants in social science research in their communities. So the first two questions here will be answered by compiling and analyzing a new Canadian social science Indigenous research database of peer-reviewed and grade literature in multiple social science disciplines that include Indigenous peoples or communities since 2000, so 2 years after the adoption of the first Tri-Council policy statement. And the CSSI-R database will be supplemented by a second bibliographic database. So I'm not going to be talking about that today, which will compile existing peer review and gray literature on the existing institutional, organizational, and human resources related to social science research methodologies in Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. Right, so this is really briefly, just to give you sort of a sense of what we're doing and the methods that we're using and things that we're searching. It's quite a large project, so we can't do everything with this, but we search systematically in different social sciences database, so things like ProQuest and EBSCO and Web of Science, and for books and gray literature, so WorldCat, and we captured 1,500 different articles. So we started to screen those articles by title and abstract and came up with 768 pieces. And then of those 768, we've now, and it's very preliminary, these results, have coded 265, and we plan to code about 100 more, right? So we can't possibly code everything, but we're doing our best. So our coding includes things like we're looking for methods of data collection, data analyses, level of Indigenous participation in research, affiliation of the authors, so are authors Indigenous, are they non-Indigenous, and self-identification, right? We included nothing from the humanities, so this is just social sciences. We've excluded health, mental health, law, psychology, education, but health policy is included. So that's really, really brief. So I'm not a graph or pie chart person. Michelle is my quantitative R coding, expert, but I thought some of these graphs, it's really important. I think they're very telling, and I'm going to talk a little bit about at the end about what we found and sort of wise research practices. Right, so Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous epistemologies are not getting recognition. It's possible that they're being published elsewhere, but it's not being published so far in what we've seen in academic journals in the social sciences. One of the other things is that we're also moving away from more positivist research to more critical research, but what we're seeing is that it's not participatory type of research. Right, so here's just another graph that talks about discourse analysis, inductive analysis, and participatory. So you can see from this graph that there's a sharp decline in participatory research. And I'm going to talk about at the end, being an Indigenous scholar that does community-based participatory work and an Indigenous-led work, Indigenous research. This is really problematic for somebody like me who does this kind of research. It's very concerning, actually. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Right, and we also looked at participation in research, and we described participation categories on sort of a continuum. Right, so those researchers who don't use sort of human involvement, we describe a continuum level of involvement that starts with sort of no participation at all and ends with Indigenous-led research. And what was really alarming, what we found so far, is that of the 263 articles that we've coded, only 12 of them have been truly Indigenous-led research, right? So that means research that is controlled and driven by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, right? And again, I think that is a very concerning finding for somebody like me. And then when we look at self-identification, so we look at who are our authors, right? And we have to kind of look at these results lightly a little bit, but you can see Indigenous authors versus non-Indigenous authors of these journals in the social sciences. 76% of articles have authors with unknown identity, so it might be that there were more articles with Indigenous authors, but they didn't declare their identity, right? But I think this is still concerning. So again, these are very preliminary results, and we've been working on this literally up until probably, today or yesterday. But what does this mean? And I'm going to link it back a little bit to myself as an Indigenous junior scholar going up for tenure next year. So even though what we're finding is that there's more and more research on Indigenous issues over time, social scientists are not engaging in participatory research. Our research thus far revealed a preponderance of research based exclusively on analysis of government documents and reports, discourse and content analysis, research drawing on academic texts, but we're seeing a very sharp decline in Indigenous-led and participatory research. And these results are concerning. We suggest that the complete absence of participatory and Indigenous-led work in some of these journals raises questions about the recognition and impact of these approaches in the social sciences. It suggests that we're missing a significant opportunity to leverage participatory research as an effective tool for building knowledge and addressing complex social problems. And our findings suggest that these contributions reflect little direct input from and likely have little relevance to the needs, the lived realities, and knowledge of Indigenous peoples and communities. And so what I really want to say here is that in many contexts, participatory research is not a choice for Indigenous faculty, the way that it is for non-Indigenous faculty. Indigenous researchers who employ participatory research practices in the area of Indigenous studies do so amidst long-standing traditions, theories, cosmologies, and practices that require careful and thoughtful relationship building and consideration when framed within research. Right, so if there isn't a space for my research in some of these journals, right, this has serious consequences when it comes to hiring practices, tenure and promotion committees, merit review, which focus overwhelmingly on our record of peer-reviewed publications, which apply well-established metrics, including citation indices and journal rankings, for evaluating the quality of scholarly outputs. By comparison, metrics for measuring many of the outputs associated with Indigenous research remain underdeveloped. We appear often less productive by traditional standards, having aspects of our research regarded as citizenship or service or community contributions or consulting work. Right? And so institutional adaptation, universities, to support our work and ways of knowing, have been very slow. Right, so some of the other sort of wise practices that we've sort of come up with and things that we're learning as we're going through this project, it is that journals need to give much more credence to Indigenous knowledge and participatory research. Right, so I'm doing this type of research, and a lot of my research gets published in Indigenous journals, right, which are often considered to be a little bit more fluffy or soft. Right? But it's hard, as I'm a political scientist by trade, it's hard for me for my research to get published in some of the more flagship journals, right? And those are ultimately the journals that I need to get tenure. So that's problematic. Some of the other practices that we're noticing is that authors need to be a lot more transparent in the ethics process. Right? So we're not seeing, authors aren't declaring in the articles if they've gotten community ethics support, if they've gotten institutional ethics clearance, right? So that's not clear, and it needs to be. And authors also need to be more transparent when it comes to self-identifying, and journals need to support that. I recently published an article in a more flagship type of journal that talks about all of these issues, right? But there wasn't even an opportunity for me to declare my Métis identity, and that's problematic. We want to know, right, who's writing these types of articles. Okay, and I have 1 minute. And you know what? I'm going to end there. So we have more results coming, but this has been a very, I think, a really sort of telling. And while I'm not used to graphs and charts, they are telling us a lot. And a lot of concerns have been raised when it comes to sort of Indigenous research in the social sciences. So thank you very much.
Margaret Kovach is Saulteaux and Cree ancestry. She is currently an associate professor at the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan, having received her PhD from the University of Victoria in 2007. Dr. Kovach's publications have had a significant impact on her field. Of note, her monographs, Indigenous Methodologies, Characteristics, Conversations, and Context, published through the University of Toronto Press, won the Scholarly Writing Award and the Saskatchewan Book Awards, and widely used as a research text locally, nationally, and internationally. Kovach has been successful in attaining external funding from SSHRC and is a collaborator on interdisciplinary research projects with faculty outside the University of Saskatchewan. She was the planning co-chair of the University of Saskatchewan hosted National Forum Building Reconciliation, Universities Answering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Actions. Dr. Kovach is a member of the Royal Society of Canada. So, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thank
you. So this works. Okay, hot dog. Well, tonze, bonjour, and greetings. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the territory. I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral caretakers of this land and this traditional territory upon which we are gathering today, including the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. As mentioned, my name is Margaret, but you can call me Maggie. I go by Maggie. Yeah, Maggie.
I can't do it. It's too much.
We'll get there. We'll get there, Chelsea. And I want to bring greetings to you from Treaty 6 territory, where I live in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I'm a faculty member at the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. But I also bring greetings to you from Treaty 4 territory. I am from Pasqua First Nations, and that's in Treaty 4 is in southern Saskatchewan, and I'm of, as mentioned, Plains Cree and Saulteaux ancestry. I have a very brief 10 minutes, and so in that very brief 10 minutes, I'm probably going to talk quite quickly. I don't have any PowerPoints, so hopefully this will go okay. But if we have any questions or want any clarification, I understand that we have time for question and answer. So I have been asked today to share some of my thoughts on Indigenous research and more specifically Indigenous methodologies. And so in doing that, what I would like to do is I would like to comment on 3 points that I think are important if we're going to talk about Indigenous methodologies in particular. So first of all, I just want to do a very, very brief overview of what I see as the difference between Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies. And in particular, I do want to focus on what I see as different between the two. Secondly, I want to go very, very, very quickly over some of the aspects of Indigenous methodologies and what Indigenous methodologies involves from my understanding and conversations with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, and of course my own reflections. And thirdly, what I would like to do is I would like to respond to the question, because when I do speaking, inevitably this question does arise, and it's an important question. And the question is, who can do Indigenous methodology? So I want to just talk very briefly about that. So I'm going to just jump in right now into what I see as the difference between Indigenous research processes and practices and Indigenous methodologies. Now, I often see, and I have done this myself, where we use the term Indigenous research to mean the same thing as Indigenous methodologies. So it's almost as if we're using Indigenous research to mean Indigenous methodologies, and we don't necessarily differentiate between the two. And I think that this is problematic for a couple of reasons. And first of all, I would say that, and I think the important reason is that this lack of clarity is problematic because seeing Indigenous research and methodologies as the same thing can overtly or inadvertently lead to the appropriation of Indigenous methodologies, and hopefully that will come clear once I talk a bit more about Indigenous methodologies. Secondly, I'm a research instructor. That's what I do for the most part, and I spend a lot of time thinking about methodology. So from a research methodology perspective, which is just a real kind of pragmatic perspective, I think we have to do some work in clarifying our terms. So it's really, I think, important to be able to articulate what do we mean by Indigenous research and what do we mean by Indigenous methodologies. So, as mentioned, I can see where you would equate the two. You could see them as the same thing, and you could see them as being the same thing for a number of reasons. First of all, both Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies involve Indigenous people, Indigenous experiences, or concerns. They should, or they ought to, involve Indigenous researchers, as Chelsea was saying, and if they don't, you have to kind of raise some questions. They also should involve an understanding and a knowledge of Indigenous communities in the community context, right? And finally, Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies in some way should be doing research that benefits Indigenous communities. So there should be some benefit to the communities and some reciprocity. So those are the ways in which they are the same. However, I think the big difference for me is that I see Indigenous research more as an umbrella term, which can include a range of studies that may or may not use Indigenous methodologies. For example, Chelsea was talking about participatory action research. And participatory action research is what I would call an allied methodology to Indigenous, and which you have often see in Indigenous communities because it really upholds community voice and community participation. But if you look at the origins of participatory research, we know that it comes from Western thought, and it's very much imbued with a critical theory. So for me, there are a number of different methodologies. It could be community-based methodologies, ethnographies, it could even be quantitative methodologies, decolonizing approaches. This might be provocative to some people. Some people may have some sort of differences of opinion than I hold around this, and they may see the Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies are actually the same thing. However, what I think is that I do think they're different, but I do think we need more space in the academy to think about and to talk about Indigenous researchers, or Indigenous researchers, Indigenous research practices generally, the role of Indigenous theory. We really need to think about Indigenous theory. I was sitting in a presentation yesterday hosted by philosophy, and one of the areas where I think there needs to be more Indigenous scholars is within philosophy. We need more Indigenous philosophers because we need to think about Indigenous theory if we're going to move forward in Indigenous methodologies, or if we're going to have Indigenous practices that are imbued with an Indigenous informed sensibility. We will do that through theory. And so we need more space to talk about these issues. So given that, I just want to say what I'm now going to move into is talking a little bit about Indigenous methodologies, but just wanted to preface by saying, from my perspective, Not everyone may agree with me, but from my perspective, Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies, even though Indigenous methodologies might come under the umbrella of Indigenous research, they are not the same thing in totality, okay? So now I want to just very briefly talk about what is Indigenous methodologies. And I want to go through kind of a very brief sort of checklist. And I hate the term checklist, I really do, but it feels like in 10 minutes that's what we are bound to do. And so I'm just going to go through a few different aspects that I see are critical to Indigenous methodologies. First off, what I'm going to say, and actually what I say when I present, and definitely when I'm in class and in my Indigenous research class, I say to folks, okay, now I'm going to say something, and it's really the most important thing, and if you need to leave, you can leave now, because once I say this, pretty much everything else will fall into place. Indigenous methodologies is a valid methodological approach, but Indigenous methodologies, and you can use the term worldview, you can use the term philosophy, you can use the term epistemology, you can use the term ontology, you can use whatever term paradigm if you want. Indigenous methodologies are based on Indigenous knowledge systems. So a research process that is using Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous methodologies will be a research process that is guided by Indigenous philosophy or Indigenous paradigm. That is absolutely key. And so for a researcher to take up Indigenous methodologies, there has to be a belief, an understanding, and a valuing of Indigenous knowledge system. And there also has to be an understanding that Indigenous knowledges are not Western knowledges. Indigenous knowledges have been here prior to contact, prior to settlement. They are alive, they are evolving, they are with us in this room, but they are different from Western knowledge systems. So that is pretty much the key thing about Indigenous methodologies, but I'm going to also give you a couple of other things just to kind of talk a little bit, to flesh it out a little bit more. So other aspects of Indigenous methodologies includes that the researcher has an understanding of context, a rich knowledge of Indigenous place, language, ceremony. There has to be connection. So that means that the researcher has relationships. And what I've come to talk about is relational capital with the community. And that the community, definitely community that you're doing research with. The researcher must also have an understanding of the history of Indigenous communities generally and the specific community that the individual researcher is working with. There must be a significant role of Indigenous people on the research team, and it's exactly what Chelsea is saying, that Indigenous research or Indigenous methodologies should be led by Indigenous peoples. That Indigenous researchers must not only know their community, they must know themselves and acknowledge and uphold those who have assisted us. That there must be methods of gathering data within Indigenous methodologies that includes an agility with story and an agility with orality. There has to be some way of findings being interpreted and meaning made in a way that allows for Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous community context to emerge. And this is where Indigenous theory is so important and why we have to move ahead, I believe, with Indigenous theory, because it is in this finding stage where we are looking at sort of our understandings and meaning making. If we want to do it in a way that we can say we're doing our research from an Indigenous methodology, the findings have to actually be interpreted and understood from an Indigenous methodological perspective. Reciprocity and giving back is the gold standard in Indigenous methodology, so that is crucial. That is very, very important. And there needs to be a nuanced appreciation of colonial impacts and Indigenous resurgent actions. So with Indigenous methodologies, we do not necessarily center a power dynamic in terms of the settler-Indigenous power relationship. So in that sense, it's not critical theory, it's Indigenous. What we do center is Indigenous knowledges, but we are very cognizant of colonization and its impact. So Indigenous methodologies is not an easy entry into Indigenous life, and there needs to be the requisite preparation. And so ultimately, individuals ask, well, do I have the right preparation? Can I do Indigenous methodologies? And I say that, well, I mean, I can't tell you whether you can do Indigenous methodologies, but the more I work in this area, my own research, talking to people who use Indigenous methodologies, the more that I recognize that this is not solely about identity. So it's not just a situation, if you're Indigenous, you can, if you're not, you can't. It's more about your relationships and your relational connections that matter greatly. Whether or not you can do Indigenous methodologies. And, you know, sort of just finished writing a paper on why community and connections matter. But you know, sort of suffice to say they matter. And here are some questions that you might pose to yourself, which will give you an indication of whether or not you're in a place where Indigenous methodology is an approach that can really govern your research practice. So does the research benefit the community and meet the community needs? Can I clearly identify the Indigenous community that I need to involve? Do I have connections with the community? Am I trusted within the Indigenous community? Do I have relational capital? Have I had a conversation on protocols? Am I able to discern when or if a community tells me to back off? And am I willing to engage with the relationship through the good times and the bad? So just to conclude, I want to say that from my perspective, ethical Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies must be mindful of the colonial history that continues to impact Indigenous people. In Canada, the Americas, and globally, we must seek to address colonialism, racism, and inequities. And if we here at home in Canada wish to move forward with the calls to action emerging from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the stories of those who have given testimony, we must be up for being in relationship. It will be hard. Relationship will be hard. There is no doubt, but there can be no shortcuts. But if we really do want to respond to those calls to action, we must be in it for the long haul, and this includes research. And I'm going to close with some words that I heard Cornel West speak the other night at the beginning of this conference. And I'm hoping I'm quoting him correctly. I'm knowing I can't say it with the same power and pizzazz. But he said, and I think it really applies to Truth and Reconciliation and what we're doing here in Canada, we don't need the sunshine soldiers in this moment. We need the all-season lovers. We need the long-distance runners for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Our third and final panel speaker is Heather Castleden. She is a white settler scholar, born in the territory of the Yellowknife and raised in traditional territories of the Ashtamapic, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Her ancestor roots are in the UK. She's an associate professor at Queen's University, holds a Canada Research Chair in Reconciling Relations for Health, environments, and communities. A geographer, Dr. Castleden undertakes community-based participatory research in partnership with Indigenous peoples on issues that are important to them. To date, this work has mainly involved McMaster and Nunavut. Her current SSHRC-funded research examines modern treaty negotiation and implementation with Waiata First Nations. She's also leading a CIHR-funded team grant that is looking to Indigenous leadership in renewable energy as a pathway to reconciling our relations with the land, waters, and air around us and with each other. So, okay.
Hot dog. God, that's too funny. Well, that's a hard act to follow. So first, let me begin by saying I'm deeply honored to be invited by Dr. Young of the Federation to speak on this panel with these esteemed scholars, Dr. Kovach and Dr. Gabel. Thank you for the opportunity to share a story or two about my experience as a white settler scholar, working in allyship and solidarity with Indigenous partners on research questions that are important to them and fall within my area of training. And I think there are three things that I want to emphasize about what I just said. First, around allyship and solidarity. My research is indeed political, and I'm quite comfortable with that. Maybe I wasn't always, because I'm not sure back when I was, a student, if that was something that you were supposed to do, because I did hear this word objectivity rolling around, and it didn't resonate with me. It still doesn't. And I think my key message to the audience, particularly those who might be students or pre-tenure faculty, is do not be afraid. Despite what you have likely heard about our publish and perish climate in the academy, stay true to who you are and do your work in a good way. It's okay to spend a year drinking tea, if that's what you want to do. The other thing to note, especially for those who are non-Indigenous, you have the privilege of choice, which is what Dr. Gabel noted earlier, and I want to emphasize that. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is also acknowledge what I heard Maggie say, and that is that Indigenous peoples have been doing research from the beginning of time. We're talking about academic research, and we haven't created a space or place for Indigenous scholarship very well in the academy. So I do research on questions of importance to Indigenous partners that I work with. This also speaks to the importance of drinking tea. The literature can only tell us so much. After years of working as an American Sign Language interpreter in the deaf community, I moved into graduate school. I wanted to do a master's degree, and I identified a striking gap in the literature. There was very little about deafness in Indigenous communities. There was nothing about deafness in the North. So I designed a research project and flew into a remote northern community. Turns out that deafness was not a community priority. It was caribou. I should have spent some time drinking tea before I started coming up with my project, and that to me is a key message that I wanted to bring. Finally, I noted that I do research that falls within my area of training. Just because we have PhDs does not make us experts in everything. We need to put on our humility hats when we enter this circle. In doing so, you are about to begin a lifelong learning journey, and what an amazing journey it can be if you're willing to give up the reins that you've been trained to hold on to so tightly here in the academy. So Dr. Young asked us to consider the state of research, and I would just like to add to Dr. Gabel's remarks and say to the funding agency in the room, and if there's CIHR and NSERC here too, even better. Not likely, but you never know. That you need to have capacity in your peer review system. You need to be ready for the influx of grant applications that make reference to Indigenous issues, and many of these issues are actually settler issues. But my point here is actually that with reconciliation being the word of the year here in Canada, scholars in our neoliberalized academy may be drawn to the low-hanging funding fruit, and we risk perpetuating tokenism and doing harm. So by capacity, I mean you need your peer reviewers who can read, sometimes between the lines, about an applicant's ability to explain their engagement with the community in relation to the research. The reviewers need to be able to assess the level of engagement as required by the TCPS 2 Chapter 9, but more importantly, the ethical guidelines that are outlined by their Indigenous community organizational partners and governments. By capacity, I mean that peer reviewers need to have lived Indigenous experience, and they need to have a strong voice, not token voice, on peer review panels. Dr. Young also asked us to consider how Indigenous methodologies can be embraced in research. And I would add to Dr. Kovach's remarks as well by saying, again, tokenism and checking the box are just unacceptable these days. So for those of you in the audience who are settler scholars and are considering going down this path, you need to have a solid grounding in what the R's of research are. Kirkness and Barnhart in 1991 introduced us to 4 of those R's, and I'm going to touch on some of them here and maybe add a few others if time permits. We've heard Maggie talk a lot about relevance and reciprocity. I want to add to that. With respect to reciprocity, we need to ask, have I considered and do I understand what reciprocity means and looks like in this particular context, because it's not one size fits all? And have I got a plan to operationalize that understanding based on the guidance of those in that context? This could be anything from co-authorship, technical training, chopping wood, hauling water, or writing a grant that does not have your name on it, anywhere. In short, this is about engaging in research processes here, the benefits of that which are felt equally but perhaps differently by all those involved. With respect to relationality, I want to come back to drinking tea. We need to spend a lot more time listening. And then we need to spend some more time listening. And then we need to listen just a little bit more before we start asking questions. And then we need to nurture the relationships we enter into from the time we co-design our research until the time we co-produce our final knowledge outputs. And then we need to ask, are we done with this research and are we just going to be friends? And that's okay. My point is that relational work is important, if not more so than the research result. It is a lifetime connection. Margaret talked about preparation, and I would also add mentorship to that. And this relates to responsibility. We need to act in a responsible way, to conduct our research in a good way, with a good heart and good mind. And with that, I would refer to David Newhouse's work on Gananoa. In fact, read plenty of Indigenous scholars' work and cite their work in your own. We have delegitimized Indigenous knowledge for decades in the Academy in our place of privilege. And from this place of privilege, we also have the power to change that. As Jay Johnson and colleagues note, we need to learn to see our own privilege, our own context, and our own deep colonizing. And on the point of having power, we also have a responsibility to work in allyship with our Indigenous colleagues, including staff and students at our institutions, to identify institutional barriers, to operationalizing the TRC's calls to action, and then we need to be that squeaky wheel who works behind the scenes without much glory, let me be honest, to dismantle those barriers. In terms of rights, what can I say? Let's do a better job than the lip service that we are seeing from the federal government with respect to operationalizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Declaration, if you haven't read it, is not a long read, it's not a hard read. Get familiar with it. Get started there, start to learn about our shared history, our historic and modern treaties, Aboriginal rights, and so on. And a really good starting point is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, so thank you for your work there. Respect. This probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Respect Indigenous peoples, their worldviews, their ways of being, their forms of knowledge creation, and their ways of doing research. This also includes their right to refuse and your responsibility to refuse within the Academy, and I want to speak about refusal. This is a powerful R word. Here I turn to the writing of Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, who write in their 2014 paper on refusing research that social science often works to collect stories of pain and humiliation in the lives of those being researched for commodification. It furthers academic careers. However, these same stories of pain and humiliation are part of the collective wisdom that often inform the writings of researchers who attempt to position their intellectual work as decolonization. How do we learn from and respect the wisdom and desires in the stories that we overhear while refusing to portray and betray them to the spectacle of the settler colonial gaze. Here, I encourage you to respect those who do not wish to engage with you in research. It's okay to say no. But if you do proceed and undertake a relational approach to your work with the other R's in mind, do so in close collaboration with your Indigenous partners. And I encourage you to take up strengths-based approaches to counter the pain narratives that Tuck and Yang speak of. A good way to think about this is, if someone told this story about me, my family, my community, my nation, would I be okay with it? As Audra Simpson puts it, what am I revealing here and why? Where will this get us? Who benefits from this and why? Dr. Young also asked me to speak particularly about community-based participatory research, as this is a large part of what I do. And here again, I turn to the words of Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, who write about this type of research and other research approaches that involve participants in constructing the design and collection of voice as data. These processes are not immune to the fetish for pain narratives. It is a misconception that by simply building participation into a project, by increasing the number of people who collaborate in collecting data, ethical issues of representation, voice, consumption, and voyeurism are resolved. So refusal is not just the act of saying no. Tuck and Yang make it clear that refusal in research makes way for other R words, for resistance, reclaiming, recovery, repatriation, and regeneration. It is indeed a generative stance. I could go on and on about Tuck and Yang, but instead I will say it was really the best read of the year for me, so I encourage you to do it. It's a good read in a most unsettling way. I'll just conclude then with two other words, and I change from the R words to the H words. Humor and humility. So humility, I want to come back to my story about deafness in Caribou in a Dene community. So on a cold winter day in January, I arrived in a fly-in community, the community of Lutzelk'e, Dene First Nation, on the east arm of Great Slave Lake. And I went to the northern store to look for a guy that my friend said she knew, and she would tell him that I was coming. So I found him fairly quick and asked if he'd take me hunting. He looked me up and down, said, "Not like that." And he was talking about my clothes. I wasn't dressed for the occasion. I didn't have the expertise to go hunting in January in the Northwest Territories. But it gets better. There were 5 guys on skidoos, all pulling sleds, and me. I got tucked into one of those sleds, and JC, the guy I met in the northern store, told me to keep my head down. I didn't ask why, but I probably should have. Instead, I stuck my head out as we were sledding across the lake at 50 miles an hour, and I got a face full of snow and ice pelting me from the back of the skidoo. I didn't have the expertise to go hunting in January in the Northwest Territories. But it gets better. We stopped for tea on the middle of the frozen lake, and they all went pee. And then I realized I had to, too. I'll leave that to your imagination. I didn't have the expertise to go hunting in January in the Northwest Territories, but it gets better. We hit the woods on the other side of the lake, and after a few twists and turns, I felt myself falling out of the toboggan. I hollered as the skidoos kept going, and then it was quiet. I looked around, I looked down, and I had no food, I had no water, I had no compass, no bearing, and most importantly, I had no gun. And I was thinking, geez, do caribou get aggressive in January? I have absolutely no idea. About 20 minutes later, JC came back, laughing hysterically. I started laughing too, and the very next day I became known as that girl who fell out. It was a great way to meet people in the community. And so I think I'd come back to humor. If you cannot laugh at yourself, at your own ignorance, this is probably not the right research trajectory for you. Humility and humor, honesty and hope, I think, seem to go a long way and seem to be really important characteristics in this ongoing journey of reconciliation and healing. Reconciliation isn't a noun for me. It's not an endpoint. It's a verb. It's an action word with no ending. And I think I'll leave it at that, with acknowledging first and foremost with gratitude my Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Nuchalnath, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Anishinaabe, Métis, Inuit, and other many teachers and mentors that I've had over the years who have helped me, who have cried with me, who have laughed with me, and taught me so much along the way. Thank you.
We have the head of our federation there, a church leader there. I think you should think very carefully about doing something like our CAP did, which is this, it really did make a difference, not enough, but guidelines for wise research. Because I think the universities are going to need that leadership. We're talking about opening up the tenure assessment of young academics. It's very, very difficult to get them to change unless you and Shirk are speaking to change. So I hope that's the takeaway from this session. You guys got some leadership responsibility if we're going to move on. Thank you so much.